is going down like young Jock. I'm telling you, Caitlin Clark was pissed off. She was not happy with the substitutions being taken out every 2 minutes, and she voiced it after the game.
That's not spin from a message board. That's the reporting, and it's Caitlin Clark herself saying it. She was angry after Wednesday's loss in Los Angeles, and she didn't hide it. The real question isn't whether she was upset. It's why Indiana built a return plan that was almost guaranteed to upset her.
We got a couple quotes here, and we got video of Caitlin Clark abruptly being subbed out over and over. Just ridiculous. This is in the article on the IndyStar by Chloe Peters.
Watch that pattern again. In, out, in, out. This isn't a coach resting a starter in a blowout, and it isn't garbage time. This is a returning all-star getting pulled off the floor every 2 to 3 minutes on a loop in a road game Indiana was actively trying to win, broadcast nationally. Fans watching at home noticed it in real time, long before any article came out, and so did Clark, sitting on that bench, watching her own game get chopped into pieces.
Here it says, Clark did not look like her usual self on Wednesday, playing in 2 to 3 minute spurts as a condition of her minutes restriction, something she said when asked about that setup. She said, "That was not my decision. That was somebody else's decision. That wasn't on me. I ain't want to do that. That was somebody else."
There it is, straight from IndyStar's Chloe Peterson, who covers this team every single day and has Clark's trust. Notice what Clark didn't say. She didn't say, "I understand the plan, I'm on board." She said the plan wasn't hers. Somebody else decided how her comeback would look, and she went along with it, because that's what a professional does when the organization tells her to. But she wanted it on the record that it wasn't her call. Hold on to that sentence, because the real reason this plan ended up looking this extreme doesn't get explained until later in this video. And once you hear it, the 2-minute subs stop looking like ordinary caution. They start looking like something else entirely.
Decision. She was also quoted as saying, "It's really hard when you're playing 3 minutes, sub out 3 minutes, 3 minutes, then you're on the bench." Clark said, "It's really, really hard to get in the flow. For the most part, I got good looks. Some of them went, some of them didn't. I probably didn't get to have a feel for the game as I usually do. It's just really, really hard for me to play in that scenario. But overall, my body feels great, so that's the positive I can take from."
Listen to how she breaks it down. 3 minutes in, sit down. 3 minutes in, sit down. She says directly that it's hard to find a flow playing that way, and for a shooter, flow isn't a mood, it's mechanics. Footwork, base, release, all of it built on repetition and rhythm. The same rhythm that's made her jumper one of the most trusted in the league all season. Interrupt that every 180 seconds, and even one of the best shooters alive is going to look a step behind. Notice she's not blaming anyone here. She's diagnosing her own performance almost clinically. Good looks, she says. Some went in, some didn't. That's not an excuse. That's a point guard explaining exactly why a normal night looked abnormal.
She was also quoted as saying, "I told our trainers after the game that it stinks we didn't win and we didn't play very well, but I'll take it as a win how my body feels and how I really felt out there. I didn't even feel very winded."
Now here's the sentence that should stop you cold. She wasn't even winded. Read that twice. Indiana's entire stated justification for chopping her minutes into 2 and 3 minute increments was conditioning, easing a player back into game shape after a long layoff. And the player at the center of that plan is telling ESPN and IndyStar in the same interview that her body felt great and she wasn't tired. If the goal was managing her endurance, her own endurance is telling you the plan solved a problem that on this particular night she says she didn't have. This isn't even the first time she's pushed back on this exact kind of plan. Last June, working back from a quad injury that helped hold her to just 13 games the entire season, Clark called minutes restrictions silly to reporters, saying flatly that she didn't want to be out there unless she was 100%, that she was there to win, not to log 20 quiet minutes. This year, the language was softer. The frustration underneath it wasn't.
She played 3 minutes and 25 seconds in the first quarter and then came out. Then she played 4 minutes and 25 seconds, split 2 quarters, okay? In the second quarter, she played 3 minutes and 8 seconds. The third quarter, she played 2.5 minutes. In the fourth quarter, she played 3 minutes and 17 seconds.
Let's put real numbers on this, because vague descriptions undersell how extreme it actually was. 3 minutes 25 in the first quarter, 3:08 in the second, roughly 2.5 in the third, 3:17 in the fourth. Added up, and Indiana's best player, a guard averaging north of 21 points and better than 8 assists a night, third in scoring and second in assists league-wide, played somewhere around 12 or 13 total minutes in a 40-minute game, in bursts of 2 and 3 at a time, instead of the 8, 10, 12-minute stretches a starter normally gets. Compare that to how most teams handle a returning star elsewhere in professional sports. Most gradual return plans still let a player build one real extended stretch on the floor, 12 or 15 minutes together, so the body and the game rhythm come back at the same time. Bench specialists log more continuous run than Clark got on an average Tuesday. There's a meaningful difference between a minute's restriction, which every team in every sport uses, and 4 separate cameo appearances stitched together into one box score. What Indiana ran on Wednesday looked a lot more like the second thing, and it showed up on the final margin too. Indiana lost by 14, a game the Fever were never fully out of, with their best player spending more of the fourth quarter on the bike than on the floor.
And then you got Stephanie White subbing Caitlin Clark out left and right. Look at this. Caitlin Clark is ready to sub in. And Stephanie White's just going to pull her from the check-in table. Caitlin Clark's there to sub in. And now, boom, she's just go back to the bench.
And this part doesn't even need a quote because you can just watch it. Clark's standing at the scorer's table, ready to check back in, and Stephanie White waves her off. Sophie Cunningham comes in instead. A few trips down the floor later, same routine, except now it's Lexi Hull. Up, down, up, down. It wasn't buried in a box score either. It played out live, on the broadcast, with the announcers talking through it in real time, and clips of it started circulating within minutes of the final buzzer. The reaction split almost immediately into 2 camps. One side saw a franchise being careful with its most important asset. The other saw a coaching staff that couldn't get out of its own way, embarrassing a former MVP candidate on national television in Los Angeles. Neither side is wrong to have a reaction. What's true is that if you clipped this sequence with no context and showed it to a casual fan, they'd assume Clark was either hurt worse than reported or buried in some kind of doghouse. She was, by every account, neither. She was, according to her own coaching staff, simply following the plan.
Ridiculous. Okay, this is the article courtesy of Chloe Peterson on the IndyStar. Why Caitlin Clark struggled in return from back injury suffered 2 weeks ago.
That's the actual headline IndyStar ran. Not Fever survived with Clark back, struggled. And once you watch the tape, it's hard to argue with that word, even though the struggle had almost nothing to do with her legs. Here's why this particular loss matters more than a normal mid-season game, and why Indiana had so little room to get this wrong. The Fever came into Wednesday sitting around 12 wins and 8 losses, squarely in the middle of a crowded playoff race, the kind of standings picture where 2 or 3 results either way decide seeding in August. There's a business layer to this too. A huge share of Indiana's national broadcast windows, ticket demand, and merchandise revenue over the last 2 seasons has been built directly around Clark's presence on the floor. Road arenas around this league have been selling out specifically for the games she plays in. That's simply the reality of what her name does to a schedule, and it's part of why a night like Wednesday, where she's on the injury report, on the floor, and still barely playing, creates so much noise. This also isn't the first time this season Indiana has fumbled how it handled her back. Back in May, she missed a game against Portland with this exact injury without ever appearing on the league's official injury report, a lapse serious enough that the WNBA formally warned the franchise over it. So when people ask whether this was really about caution, it's worth remembering the organization already has one documented slip on this specific issue this year.
Here it is. Especially when you haven't played in 2.5 weeks in a game, and a game environment is just so much more different than anything we can replicate. This is Caitlin Clark. This is a quote from Cece. Okay? Clark told the IndyStar and ESPN following the 106-92 loss, "Even though my workouts have been hard, and I've responded well to those. You just don't know when you get into a game environment. Obviously, I'm such a competitor. I think I can play more, but sometimes that can get you in trouble. It's a long season. It's a long year, and a couple of games like this isn't going to mess you up. Just get your feel back, and it'll be okay.
Which brings us back to what Stephanie White actually said out loud. Anytime you miss a couple of weeks, it takes time to get acclimated, time to build endurance. Taken on its own, that's a completely standard thing for a coach to say. Gradual return to play protocols after a real injury layoff are normal in every professional sport, and no reasonable person should want a team throwing an injured star back in for 35 minutes just because fans are impatient, especially a coach who had just watched her point guard take an uncalled fist to the throat 2 weeks earlier. That's the fair version of this story, and it deserves to be said plainly. But White's explanation only covers half of what actually happened on the floor. Endurance explains why you'd cap her minutes. It doesn't fully explain why you'd cap them in units this small, disrupting her rhythm on almost every single possession, especially when the player in question is telling 2 different outlets on the record that she wasn't tired. Caution and overcorrection can look identical from the outside. The difference is usually in the details, and the details here are messy enough that reasonable fans have landed on both sides of it.
Overall, Stephanie White said anytime you missed a couple of weeks, it's going to take time to get acclimated. It's going to take time to build endurance.
Give Clark credit for how she handled her half of it. Every time she came off the floor, she got on the exercise bike to keep her legs warm, and she wore a heat therapy pad on her lower back between shifts, doing everything in her power to stay ready for a night that kept pulling her readiness out from under her. It's the kind of behind-the-scenes preparation that never shows up in a highlight package, and it lines up with how teammates and opposing coaches routinely describe her as one of the most obsessive workers in the sport. The effort was never the problem. None of it changed what ended up in the box score. But it's worth knowing this wasn't a star mailing in a strange night. It was a star doing everything asked of her inside a plan she didn't design.
Clark could never truly get into a rhythm because of those seemingly constant subs. She made sure her body stayed warm the entire time, using the exercise bike in periods off the court and wearing a heat therapy pad on her back.
So who actually gets held accountable if this doesn't get fixed? That's the question fans were already asking before the final buzzer, and it's one Indiana's front office can't dodge for much longer. Stephanie White has built her reputation as a sharp, tactical mind, and most coverage of this team all season has been sympathetic to how hard this particular balancing act really is. But sympathy only stretches so far when your best player has now, twice in 13 months, used the word silly, or its equivalent, to describe how her own team is handling her body. At some point, that stops being a coaching quirk and starts being a pattern the front office has to answer for, whether that means changing the plan itself, changing how it gets communicated to the player living inside it, or eventually changing who's making the call in the first place. Fair or not, that's the standard that comes with building an entire organization around one player. When things go well, she gets the credit. When a night like this happens in front of a national audience, the franchise doesn't get to hide behind her either.
Now, this is courtesy of Chloe Peterson in the IndyStar. The Indiana Fever are a joke. The Indiana Fever are a flat-out joke. They are a joke of an organization. This is. I'm glad Caitlin Clark said something, and she just didn't just sit quiet. This was a bad plan from the Indiana Fever.
So what happens now? By Indiana's own plan, Clark won't play Thursday, when the schedule brings back the very same Phoenix team involved in that June 24th incident. She says she's hopeful her restriction gets bumped up to 25 minutes by Sunday, when the Fever face a very good Las Vegas team on the road. If that number holds, this 3-minute burst version of Caitlin Clark was a one-night experiment, not the new normal. If it doesn't, and this same pattern shows up again against Las Vegas, it stops being a one-game story and starts being the story of the Fever's entire stretch run, right when they need her most. A star who says the plan wasn't hers, a coach whose own explanation only covers half the story, and a league that's already shown once this season it can't always protect the player everyone builds the broadcast schedule around. Maybe this really was nothing but careful medicine after a frightening injury, exactly what you'd want a franchise to do with its most valuable asset. Or maybe a team that got burned once already overcorrected in front of a national audience and helped cost itself a winnable game in the process. Both readings fit what you just watched. So where do you land? Drop it in the comments, tell me whether you think Indiana got this right or got it badly wrong. And if you want the next update the moment it breaks, hit subscribe and turn the notifications on.
And somebody needs to be fired, man. Like when are jobs gonna start being taken, man? Because this shit is ridiculous. Like the fans are tired of it. Everyone is sick of this clown show, and heads need to start rolling, man. Somebody needs to be held accountable.
This is the fullest version of what Clark actually told reporters, and it's worth sitting with because it's more honest than most athletes get in a post-game scrum. A game environment, she says, is nothing like practice, no matter how good the workouts have felt. She admits she's such a competitor that she thinks she can handle more minutes, and that thinking, in her own words, is exactly what can get her in trouble. That's Clark essentially telling you she doesn't fully trust her own instincts right now. Not because her talent is in question, because her body has broken down on her before, and she knows exactly what pushing too early has cost her in past seasons. That's not a player complaining about a coach. That's a competitor negotiating with her own instincts in public, on the record. Now here's what actually happened 2 weeks before any of this, and it's the part that explains why Indiana was willing to look this cautious in front of a national audience. On June 24th, back home in Indianapolis, the Fever were hosting Phoenix in a game that was tight from start to finish. Second quarter, scramble for a loose ball right in front of Indiana's own bench, and Mercury forward Alyssa Thomas, a veteran all-star in her own right, drove her fist into Clark's neck. No foul was called. Play continued. Clark stayed on the floor, later grabbing at her lower back after a hard landing on a separate play. And by the third quarter, her night was over. Indiana lost that game 111-109, a 2-point margin that might have gone differently with her on the floor for the finish. The next day, the league reviewed the footage, upgraded the play to a flagrant foul 2, and suspended Thomas 1 game for what the WNBA itself described as reckless contact to the throat area. Stephanie White did not hold back afterward. She called the no call egregious and utterly disrespectful and pointed out her team was whistled for 11 fourth-quarter fouls against 2 for Phoenix, on top of a similarly physical matchup just 2 nights earlier where Fever forward Maisha Hines-Allen was ejected, and where even Mercury veteran DeWanna Bonner, who left this same Fever team under sour circumstances the year before, picked up a technical of her own. White's fury in that moment wasn't about strategy. It was that her franchise player kept absorbing hits the officials weren't calling. And this isn't new for Clark. Rewind to her rookie season in 2024, when Chicago's Chennedy Carter checked her with a shoulder that the league also upgraded to a flagrant after the fact, uncalled live. Clark's own response at the time was that she figured she'd just have to take a couple of hard shots a game and try not to let it bother her. So when you watch Indiana carve her minutes into 3-minute increments 2 weeks after a fist to the throat went unpunished in real time, that pattern reads differently. This wasn't purely about rebuilding cardio after a layoff. This was a franchise that had just watched the league fail to protect its most important player, trying to control the one variable it actually could control: how much contact she was exposed to on any given possession.